Welcome to the underbelly of Victorian London, to a world of foul smells, disease, and desperation. This is life in a stinking Victorian doss house, London, 1888. The city was wrapped in a restless fog, the kind that clung to gas lamps and blurred the edges of every shape it touched. Beneath that gray shroud, life pulsed like an aching heart. Horses clattered over wet cobblestones, hawkers shouted from corners, and the chimneys of 10,000 factories vomited smoke into a sky that never saw the sun. To the world, this was the capital of civilization, the jewel of empire, the seat of progress, the mighty brain of an industrial age. But under the glow of progress, in the alleys where the fog never lifted, lay another London, hungry, foul, smelling, and forgotten. The West End glittered with wealth. Gentlemen in tall hats strolled past glittering shop windows, and ladies stepped down from carriages in silk and fur. But to the east, beyond the great curve of the Thames, the city rotted. In Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Limehouse, life was measured not by comfort but by survival. The pavements were slick with refuse, the gutters clogged with ash and dung, and the smell of decay lingered everywhere, a mixture of smoke, gin, and human misery. It was here that the doss houses stood, like open wounds in the body of London. For the poor, the doss house was both refuge and punishment. Work was uncertain, food expensive, and rent impossible. Factories had replaced men with machines. Workshops demanded 16 hours a day for starvation pay. When wages failed or illness struck, there was nowhere else to go. The workhouse loomed like a prison, its rules crueler than the streets themselves. So men and women drifted to the lodging houses, the dosses, where for a few pennies they could buy one more night inside four walls. They came with empty pockets and heavier hearts, carrying all they owned in a bundle or a tin box, their boots worn to paper, their spirits eroded by hunger. The door to a doss house was often a single slab of wood beneath a crooked sign. Inside, the air changed immediately, thicker, warmer, and suffocating. The stench struck like a physical blow, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, spilled beer, and cheap gin hung in the air so heavily that newcomers gagged. The keeper, usually a gruff man with a candle stub in his fist, demanded payment up front, a penny for the seat, 2 pence for the kip, 4 pence if you want a bed. Coins clinked, the door shut, the world outside ceased to exist. Those who paid the penny sat shoulder to shoulder on benches that lined the walls of the common room. There they would sleep sitting, heads drooping forward, hands clasped between their knees. Sometimes a rope was strung across the room from which the sleepers leaned, resting their heads on the course line until dawn. For 2 pence, one could stretch out on the floor, a sea of bodies pressed together, each trying to claim a few inches of filthy plank. The lucky few with 4 pence climbed to the upper room, where rows of narrow beds, wooden boxes filled with damp straw awaited. The mattresses were black with age, alive with lice, and smelled of every previous occupant. Blankets were rare, and the windows, if they existed, were nailed shut against the cold. The sound inside was constant: snoring, coughing, muttering, the rattle of lungs poisoned by smoke and disease. Somewhere a child whimpered, somewhere a woman laughed too loudly, her breath sour with gin. The room never fully darkened. A single candle guttered on a table, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked plaster walls. The air grew hotter with each hour as bodies pressed closer for warmth. Those who could not sleep stared at the ceiling, watching the candle's reflection tremble in puddles of condensation. Outside, the city groaned, carts creaked, church bells tolled, but inside the doss house, time dissolved into the rhythm of breathing and the occasional, dreadful silence when a breath did not come again. Many who found their way here had not always been poor. Some had once worked in the shipyards or factories, earning enough to rent a small room and eat a decent meal. but accidents were common. A crushed hand or a broken back meant instant dismissal. Employers had no use for damaged men. Compensation was a word for lawyers, not laborers. Others had been servants dismissed for age or theft, though sometimes for no reason at all. Women who lost their husbands often lost their homes soon after. Without income, they sold their furniture piece by piece until nothing was left but the clothes on their backs. Then they drifted east, following the rumor of cheap lodging, until they found themselves standing before the door of a doss house with a coin in their palm and shame in their eyes. Inside there was no privacy. People changed clothes, if they had any, in full view of others. The smell of sweat and sickness clung to the air. The floorboards were sticky with spilled beer, and the walls stained yellow from smoke. Water was scarce, soap rarer still. In one corner might stand a rusted bucket, half full and black with grime, used for washing, drinking, and worse. Yet for many this was safety. Outside waited the brutal cold, the watchful constables, and the gangs who prowled for easy victims. A night indoors, no matter how foul, meant a few hours without fear of the knife or the frost. Every morning, before dawn, the keeper bellowed them awake. Up, out with you, he'd shout, banging on doors, kicking benches, shaking shoulders that might be dead. The lodgers stumbled into the gray light, coughing, squinting, clutching their bundles. The smell followed them into the street, mingling with the smoke of early fires. They joined the tide of workers heading for docks and factories, though many had no work to go to. Some begged at corners, some picked rags from refuse heaps, some simply wandered until night came again and the doss door opened once more. The life expectancy of such a lodger was short. Disease spread fast in the overcrowded rooms, and malnutrition gnawed at every bone. Yet the city seemed indifferent. The newspapers wrote of empire and exploration. Parliament debated tariffs and colonies. The poor were statistics, their suffering hidden behind euphemisms, casual labor, temporary distress, vagrancy. Only a few reformers dared to tell the truth. They wrote of rooms where 50 people slept in spaces meant for 10, of children lying beside corpses, of women giving birth on the floor while rats scurried underfoot. Their reports shocked polite society for a week or two, but soon the headlines faded and the streets of Whitacapel filled again each night. To walk those streets after dark was to witness despair made visible. Gas lamps threw weak pools of yellow light, barely cutting through the fog. Figures huddled in doorways, faces hidden beneath shawls. The smell of gin drifted from taverns, mingling with sewage from open drains. Somewhere a man shouted, somewhere a woman screamed. The city never slept, but it dreamed badly. The Thames, black and sluggish, carried away its waste and its secrets alike. And above it all, the clock of St. Paul's struck midnight solemn, distant, indifferent. For newcomers to London, the shock was immediate. They arrived from the countryside with letters of introduction, or with nothing but hope, and within weeks that hope was gone. Rents in decent neighborhoods were impossible. Employers demanded experience, references, and obedience. The newcomers found only hunger. They sold what little they had: coats, rings, tools, until they were left with their own labor, which no one wanted. Then came the descent, a cheap lodging for a few nights, then a poorer one, then the doss house. Once there, few ever climbed out again. The filth of poverty was not only physical, it clung to the soul. Children grew up in these places knowing no other world. They played among refuse heaps, chased rats for amusement, and begged scraps from tavern doors. Many died before 10, their bodies too small for coffins, their names forgotten before the graves were filled. The ones who survived learned early the ways of the street: how to steal, how to lie, how to vanish when the constable came. Some girls were sold before they were 12, some boys before they were 15. And always, at the end of every path, stood the doss house, waiting like a hungry mouth. Yet for all its misery, there was life within those walls, fierce, defiant life. The lodgers talked, joked, argued. They shared crumbs and stories. In the dim light, laughter sometimes rose unexpectedly, a brief spark against the gloom. A man might tell of better days, of the ship he once served on or the wife he lost. Others listened, half dreaming, half envious. The doss house was not only a shelter, it was a community of the abandoned, bound by suffering and a strange, desperate fellowship. Sometimes, in the early hours, the door would creak open and a latecomer would stumble in, soaked to the bone, clutching a penny. The keeper might grumble, but money was money, and he would let the wretch inside. The newcomer's eyes would sweep across the room, the dim figures on benches, the heap of sleeping bodies, and a kind of dull resignation would settle on his face. He would find a corner, drop his bundle, and sit, head in hands, until exhaustion overcame him. By morning, he would look no different from the rest. The doss house had a way of erasing faces, blending them into one gray mass of suffering humanity. The smell of the place could cling to a man for days. Even after washing in a public fountain, the odor of rot and mildew seemed to seep from the skin itself. It was not just the smell of poverty. It was the smell of hopelessness, of nights spent in air so foul that it seemed to coat the lungs. Doctors who visited such places wrote that the atmosphere was unfit for beasts, and yet hundreds slept there every night. The landlords grew rich from it, charging pennies to the desperate, caring little whether they lived or died. For every one who perished, another took his place by evening. London's poor were endless, an army that replenished itself from the countryside and the colonies alike. By day, the lodgers scattered like shadows. Some trudged to the docks, hoping for a day's work unloading ships. Others joined the endless search for odd jobs sweeping streets, hauling coal, scrubbing floors. Women sold flowers or matches or themselves. Children scoured gutters for nails and bits of metal. Each penny earned went first to the doss house. Only what remained bought food. Many chose gin instead. For a moment, the drink made the hunger fade and the filth blur. Gin shops thrived in the East End narrow rooms where a penny could buy a cup of burning liquid that promised warmth and forgetfulness. Mother's ruin, they called it, but for many it was mercy. As night fell again, the pattern repeated. The same faces returned, dragging their feet through the mud, drawn by the faint promise of shelter. The keeper counted his coins, and the door closed. Inside, the stench deepened, the air thickened, and the slow dance of survival began anew. There was something almost ritualistic about it, the scraping of benches, the shuffle of boots, the murmured curses. It was as if the doss house were not merely a building, but a living creature, inhaling misery each night and exhaling despair each morning. Some reformers believed that the poor had chosen this life, that laziness or vice had brought them low. They never saw the factory doors closed to those too old, or the seamstress dismissed for sickness, or the laborer crippled by the very machine he had served. The doss house was not the cause of poverty. It was the symptom of a society that measured human worth in shillings, and yet, in official records, the lodgers were labeled vagrants, undesirables, the residuum. They were not people, they were a problem. There were stories whispered among them, half true and half dreamed, of a man who had once been a clerk, respectable and educated, until a fire took his family and his mind. He now swept floors for a crust and recited poetry to himself in the dark. Of a woman who had been a singer in a music hall until her beauty faded and the drink claimed her. Of a boy who had been sent to the city to apprentice and ended up in a thieves' den. Each story began differently, but all ended the same in the stinking air of the lodging house. Outside, the city marched toward modernity. New bridges rose across the Thames, trains thundered into gleaming stations, gas lamps gave way to electricity, but none of that light reached the East End. The Doss House stood unchanged, a relic of human neglect. Visitors who came out of curiosity often left in horror. Some fainted at the smell, others fled at the sight of so many faces pressed together in the dark. A few took up pens, hoping that words might move the conscience of the nation, but words could not compete with industry's profit or society's indifference. There were nights when the fog was so thick that even inside it seemed to seep through the walls. The candle flames guttered, the air grew heavy, and the sound of coughing became a chorus. In those moments, the Doss House felt less like a refuge and more like a tomb. Men slept sitting up, afraid to lie down for fear they might never rise again. The keeper moved among them with a lantern, checking who still breathed. If someone had died, he said nothing, only waited for morning to drag the body away before the next paying soul arrived. And yet, despite everything, there was resilience in that darkness, a kind of stubborn will that refused to surrender. The poor clung to life with a fierceness the rich could never imagine. A loaf of bread shared among three, a song hummed quietly in the corner, a joke told through chattering teeth. These were acts of defiance. They proved that even in the depths of degradation, the human spirit could still flicker like that lone candle in the muck. Children, especially, carried that fragile light. They played with scraps of wood, drew in the dust, and laughed at nothing at all. To them, the Doss House was not disgrace, it was home. They knew every creak in the floor, every friendly face, every hiding place from the keeper's stick. But childhood in such places was brief. By 8 or 9, the girls were sent into service, if they were lucky, to the streets if they were not. The boys joined gangs, stealing coal or food, learning the art of survival before they could write their names. Some ended up in prison, some in graves, and some back in the same Doss houses where they were born. It was a circle without end. Occasionally, visitors from the West ventured into this world, clergymen, journalists, philanthropists. They came armed with notebooks and good intentions, escorted by policemen who warned them not to linger. The sight that greeted them was unforgettable. Rows of narrow beds filled with hollow-eyed men, the air so thick it seemed solid, the floor slick with filth. One visitor wrote that the stench burned the throat like acid. Another said it was like entering the lungs of hell itself. They left, shaken, and wrote their reports that filled newspapers for a week before being forgotten. The poor remained unchanged as they always had. To survive in such a place required more than endurance. It required the ability to become invisible, to accept humiliation as a daily meal. Dignity had no currency here. Men who once prided themselves on neat coats and clean hands now fought over scraps of bread. Women who once dreamed of marriage and respectability now measured their worth in pennies. And yet, even here, some clung to traces of pride. They polished their boots with rags, straightened their collars, and tried to look human when they stepped outside. It was a small rebellion against the world that had forgotten them. On Sundays, the city grew quieter. Church bells rang across the rooftops, calling the faithful to worship. In the East End, few answered. Some were too weary, some too ashamed, and some too angry at a God who seemed to favor the rich. But the bells still reached the Doss houses, their muffled sound mixing with the snores and coughs within. For a brief moment, the city seemed united by sound, one half praying for salvation, the other simply trying to survive it. As years passed, reformers pushed for change. They demanded inspections, sanitation, and humane conditions. Slowly, grudgingly, laws were passed, but progress came at a crawl, and the landlords found loopholes. They scrubbed the floors before inspectors came, replaced a few mattresses, and called it improvement. Then, when the officials left, the filth returned. The poor still came, because they had nowhere else to go. Winter was the cruelest season. The cold cut through every crack, turning the air to ice. Breath hung in clouds, and even the rats seemed slower. Fires were rare, coal cost money. People slept in their clothes, huddled together for warmth. Sometimes the frost crept in and never left. A man would close his eyes at night and not wake again. His body would be stiff by morning, a pale shape among the living. The keeper would curse, drag him out, and make room for another. Life went on, indifferent as ever. By the late 1880s, the East End had become a byword for misery. Writers described it as a city of the damned. The murders of Jack the Ripper would soon draw the world's eyes to Whitechapel, but long before the killer came, death already walked those streets in silence. The doss houses were its temples. Each night, the poor offered up their bodies in exchange for sleep, and each morning they awoke those who did to begin the ritual again, and London, vast and glittering, pretended not to notice. Yet history remembers what comfort forgets. The doss houses were more than dens of filth. They were mirrors held up to the conscience of an empire. They showed the price of progress, the human cost hidden beneath the engines of industry. For every mansion in Belgravia, there was a cellar in Spitalfields. For every banquet, a hunger. For every lighted window, a shadowed door. And through those doors shuffled men, women, and children whose names history never wrote, the silent builders of the modern age, the fuel of a nation's greatness, consumed and discarded. When dawn broke, gray and cold, the fog would lift just enough to reveal their faces as they filed out into the streets. They looked like ghosts, thin and pale, fading into the crowd, but they were not gone. They would return when night fell again, drawn by the only home left to them, the stinking, suffocating, merciless embrace of the Victorian doss house. The morning light that crept into the narrow alleys of Whitechapel was thin and reluctant, as if even the sun hesitated to touch those streets. It filtered weakly through the grime-streaked windows of the doss house, painting the walls with a sickly yellow glow. The night's stench lingered in the air, sweat, gin, damp straw, and despair, a blend so potent that it seemed to crawl into the skin of anyone who breathed it. Outside, the first cries of the street sellers began to echo: hot eels, fresh taters, cold cheap, the anthem of survival in a city that had forgotten its own poor. From the dark interior of the lodging house, figures began to stir. They were neither awake nor alive in the full sense of the word, more like phantoms roused from uneasy dreams. One by one, they straightened from the benches, blinked against the light, and prepared to face another day that would offer them little more than the last. These were the faces of the forgotten men, women, and children who had become invisible to the world that bustled only a few streets away. To the polished boots of London's wealth, they were shadows. But each face carried a story written in lines of suffering and endurance. There was old Tom, who had once been a dockworker, strong as an ox, until an accident crushed his hand. The shipping company had no use for a cripple, and charity had no place for a man who could no longer earn. His wife died of fever, his children were sent to the workhouse, and he drifted to the East End with nothing but a stump wrapped in a filthy rag. Each morning he walked to the docks, hoping for a miracle, some foreman soft enough to give him a chance, but hope had long since become a ghost. His eyes, once sharp with pride, were now dulled by the repetition of refusal. Still, he returned every day, as if habit itself were a form of faith. Near him sat Mary Kettle, a woman of perhaps 30, though poverty had aged her beyond recognition. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair streaked with gray, and her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame. She had come from the countryside, lured by promises of work as a seamstress. The city had devoured her dreams quickly. The factories demanded long hours for pennies, and when her eyesight began to fail from stitching by candlelight, she was dismissed without ceremony. Now she earned what she could by sewing patches for other paupers, her fingers trembling from exhaustion. Yet even in her ruin, she clung to a faded ribbon she once wore to church, a symbol of a life that might have been. Then there was the boy they called Sparrow. No one knew his real name, and perhaps he didn't either. He was small and quick, darting through the streets with a thief's instinct and a survivor's cunning. He slept in the doss house when he could pay, in doorways when he couldn't. His voice still carried the lilt of innocence, though his eyes were already old. Sometimes he sang for coins outside the pubs, rough little tunes that made the drunkards laugh. He had no mother, no father, no birthday. London itself had birthed him, a child of soot and fog. Each of them, and countless others, lived within the same walls each night, but carried separate universes of memory and regret. They were the city's unwanted congregation, bound not by faith, but by circumstance. When the keeper's wife ladled out thin broth into cracked bowls, no one spoke. The silence of the poor was heavier than words. It was a kind of dignity, a shared understanding that complaint was useless. Once they had eaten, they trickled out into the streets, vanishing into the vast machinery of London. The fog swallowed them, a ragpicker here, a crossing sweeper there, a woman scrubbing steps, a man hauling refuse. To the casual observer, they were part of the landscape, like the soot on the bricks or the rats in the gutter. But to those who watched closely, there was humanity still weary, battered, and unacknowledged. The city above them glittered with industry and invention. The newspapers spoke of progress, railways, telegraphs, steamships, and the empire's reach across the world. But progress had a shadow. For every chimney that rose, another family sank. For every warehouse that filled with goods, another home emptied of food. And beneath the iron bridges and gas lamps in the labyrinth of East End streets, the faces of the forgotten multiplied. In the evenings, the doss house filled again, and the cycle resumed. Men who had spent the day hauling barrels or shoveling coal collapsed onto the benches, their bodies caked with soot. Women came later, their skirts wet from the streets, their eyes red from smoke or tears. The air thickened with humanity, a living stew of breath, coughs, and murmured despair. And yet, among them, there were flashes of tenderness. A woman offered a crust of bread to a stranger. A man tucked his coat around a child, not his own. The poor had little, but what little they had, they shared. In the corner, near the dying fire, an old preacher sometimes appeared, a thin man with a bent back, and a voice that rasped like sandpaper. He had once been a clergyman, or so he claimed, but drink had undone him. Now he preached not from a pulpit, but from a broken chair, quoting scripture in a voice that trembled with both faith and fever. "Blessed are the poor," he would say, "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And though few listened, a hush sometimes fell over the room. For a moment, even the most hardened among them dared to believe that heaven might notice the forgotten. But faith was fragile in a place where death was so common. Each week, someone vanished, a man found drowned in the Thames, a woman carried off by fever, a child crushed under a cart. Their names faded quickly, replaced by new lodgers who knew nothing of them. The doss house was a revolving door of human misery. No one stayed long, but no one ever truly escaped. Even those who managed to find steady work often returned in time, broken again by illness or age. Poverty had a way of reclaiming its own. The landlords, meanwhile, grew rich on their misery. For them, poverty was business, a steady income from the desperate. Some owned dozens of lodging houses across the city, collecting coins by the sackful. They hired keepers to manage the filth, men as hard and merciless as the system itself. These keepers enforced order with fists and curses, driving the lodgers out at dawn and counting the bodies at night. To them, compassion was weakness. The poor were not people but revenue, and yet London's respectable citizens preferred not to see. They hurried past the narrow alleys, noses lifted, as if smell alone could separate them from the truth. When talk of reform reached Parliament, it was met with polite sympathy and little action. The poor were useful as cheap labor, as moral examples, as objects of charity when the wealthy sought redemption. But they were never seen as equals. They were the forgotten faces of a nation that prided itself on civilization. Now and then, a journalist or social reformer would venture inside, notebook in hand. They would speak to Tom, to Mary, to Sparrow, scribbling observations about the lower orders. Their words filled magazines and pamphlets, shocking polite society for a brief season. Readers gasped over breakfast, murmured pity, and then turned the page. Outrage was a luxury the poor could not afford, and the rich could not sustain. Night after night, the stories multiplied. A mother wept quietly for a baby lost to hunger. A boy dreamed aloud of joining the Navy. An old man spoke of his youth in a village that no longer existed, swallowed by a factory town. The walls of the doss house absorbed their words, their sighs, their final breaths. If walls could weep, those would have drowned long ago. London's fog was merciful in one sense. It blurred the boundaries between classes. In the thick mist, a beggar and a banker could pass within inches, unseen by each other. It was as if the city itself conspired to keep its divisions hidden. But the smell, that unmistakable odor of poverty, could not be concealed. It followed the forgotten wherever they went, a mark of their condition. Some tried to scrub it away with lye and cold water, but it clung to their rags, their hair, their skin. It was the scent of exclusion. Even in such misery, the human heart sought meaning. There were friendships formed in those dark rooms, bonds of necessity that sometimes grew into love. A man might share his last penny so that a woman could sleep under a roof instead of the rain. A child might guard an old man's bundle while he searched for work. These small acts of grace were invisible to history but vital to survival. Without them, the forgotten would have vanished entirely. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and the fog thickened against the windows, a strange peace descended. The breathing of dozens merged into one slow rhythm like the tide. The flicker of a single candle cast long shadows across weary faces. In that dim light, stripped of pretense, they looked almost holy saints of suffering, martyrs of neglect. They had lost everything but their endurance, and in that endurance there was a kind of nobility. Outside, London continued its ceaseless hum, the clop of carriage wheels, the hiss of steam, the calls of vendors. The city's pulse was relentless, indifferent to the suffering that powered it. Every loaf of bread sold in Mayfair, every bolt of silk in Piccadilly, had passed in some way through the hands of the forgotten. They cleaned, carried, swept, stitched, hauled their labor invisible, their reward almost non-existent. The streets they built were not for them to walk in comfort. They were ghosts in the machinery of progress, feeding the furnace of empire with their own flesh. Sometimes they found small pleasures, stolen from the jaws of hardship. On summer nights, when the air outside the doss house was less foul, a few would gather in the alley. Someone would produce a mouth organ, and a tune would rise thin, cracked, but defiant. Sparrow would dance, nimble as his name, while others clapped in rhythm. For a few moments, laughter echoed where despair usually dwelled. The sound startled even the rats, and perhaps the stars themselves peered through the London fog to witness it. It was not joy, not truly, but a stubborn refusal to be entirely crushed. Inside, Mary stitched late into the night, the thread trembling between her fingers. Tom sat beside her, whittling a piece of wood into a small bird, a habit he had taken up to steady his mind. The old preacher muttered verses in his sleep, his lips moving soundlessly. Sparrow lay curled under a torn coat, dreaming of ships and faraway seas. Around them, the others breathed the slow, heavy breath of exhaustion. The Doss house had many faces, but one soul, a weary, enduring, unbroken thing that refused to die. There were nights when illness swept through the lodging like fire. Fever spread from one bed to another, coughing grew into moaning, and before dawn, the keeper would find someone still and cold. The others barely noticed any more. Death was as common as dawn, a familiar guest. The body would be carried away in the morning, and the bench would be rented again that evening. The city's hunger for space left no room for grief. The dead made way for the living, and life went on. But London's conscience was stirring. Reports from reformers, doctors, and journalists began to reach Parliament. Names like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew catalogued the misery in painful detail. They described the smells, the sickness, the hopelessness not as fiction, but as fact. Their words tore through the polite lies of Victorian respectability. For the first time, the nation saw what it had hidden behind its grand facades. The faces of the forgotten began to emerge in ink and paper, staring back from the pages of social inquiry. Still, it was easier to read about them than to look at them in the flesh. In one of the reports, a description of a woman nearly identical to Mary appeared, a seamstress who slept sitting up so she wouldn't be robbed, whose hands bled from work, whose eyesight was failing. Mary never read it, of course. She could not read. But her life, and those like hers, became symbols of the age, silent witnesses to the cost of progress. The Victorians prided themselves on moral virtue, yet they built an empire on the backs of those they refused to see. As winter returned, frost crusted the inside of the Doss house windows. The lodgers huddled together for warmth, wrapped in rags and old newspapers. The fire was rarely lit now. Coal was too dear. Breath fogged the air, mingling with the smell of damp clothes and sickness. Sparrow coughed in his sleep, his thin shoulders shaking. Tom pulled him closer, sharing what warmth he could. He did not think of himself as kind, he simply could not bear to watch another child die. One morning, Sparrow did not wake. His small body was still, his lips pale. The keeper swore under his breath and dragged him away before the others stirred. When Mary opened her eyes and found the space beside her empty, she said nothing. She simply stared at the bench, then at her trembling hands, and went back to sewing. In the Doss house, sorrow was a luxury few could afford. To grieve was to pause, and to pause was to starve. But something in Tom broke that day. He left the lodging and wandered the streets aimlessly, past the docks, past the markets, past the churches whose doors were closed to men like him. He found himself by the river, staring into the black water. He thought of the boy's laughter, of his small, quick feet darting through the fog. The Thames swallowed many like him, the cities forgotten, cast off by fate and circumstance. But Tom turned away. He could not join the river yet. He still had breath, and in the strange arithmetic of survival, that was enough. Back in the East End, life continued its grim procession. The faces of the forgotten changed, but the story remained the same. A girl arrived from the countryside, clutching a bundle of rags. A man returned from prison, hollow-eyed and coughing. An old woman begged at the market until she collapsed. Each one was absorbed into the anonymous multitude of the poor. Their individuality faded, their histories erased, only the collective suffering endured, and yet, amid the darkness, seeds of change began to take root. Missions and charities appeared, offering soup, blankets, and scripture. The Salvation Army marched through the streets, their brass bands clashing with the shouts of drunkards. They sang of redemption and light, and sometimes the forgotten joined them, drawn by the promise of warmth, if not salvation. For a few hours, the Doss house emptied as its lodgers followed the hymns through the fog. They returned later, bellies full of thin soup, eyes reflecting the brief glimmer of hope. Reformers campaigned for better housing, for sanitation, for workhouses that did not break the soul. The press began to print photographs grainy, haunting images of gaunt faces and tattered clothes. The public could no longer pretend ignorance. The faces of the forgotten stared back from every page, silent accusations against comfort and indifference. Even Queen Victoria herself, upon hearing reports of the East End, was said to have wept. Whether out of pity or guilt, no one could say, but change came slowly, too slowly for most. By the time new lodging standards were proposed, Mary had succumbed to pneumonia. She died in her sleep, unnoticed until morning. The keeper called the authorities, and her body was carted away with the efficiency of routine. No one claimed her. Her ribbon, that faded scrap of color she had treasured, was left behind on the floor, trampled under muddy boots. Tom picked it up, brushed it off, and tucked it into his coat pocket. He would keep it, he decided, as a memory of the countless lives swallowed by London's hunger. Years later, when the worst of the slums were cleared, when new model dwellings rose in their place, when inspectors spoke proudly of progress, the Doss House on Flower and Dean Street still stood battered, sagging, but alive. New faces filled its benches, new names replaced the old, but the same air lingered, the same despair. The city could pave streets and raise towers, but the poor remained. Poverty merely moved, like the fog pushed from one street to another, never dispersed, only displaced. And through it all, the memory of those who came before lingered in whispers. The faces of the forgotten lived on in stories told by the few who escaped tales of hunger and endurance, of love amid decay, of humanity clinging to the last shred of dignity. They became legends of the underworld, spoken of in hushed tones by those who dared to remember. For in remembering, there was rebellion, a refusal to let them vanish completely. If one were to stand now, in that same narrow alley where the Doss House once stood, the air would smell different of exhaust and rain, not of rot. But beneath the pavement lies the dust of those who once slept shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Their bones may be gone, but their stories remain, woven into the fabric of the city they built. The faces of the forgotten still look out from the shadows, reminding the living that progress without compassion is merely another form of decay. London, in all its splendor, owes its greatness to those who had nothing, the men who carried its bricks, the women who scrubbed its floors, the children who ran its errands. Their lives were brief and brutal, but their endurance shaped the soul of the city. Every monument, every polished street stands on their silent testimony. They were the foundation upon which an empire rose, and yet history barely remembers their names. As dusk falls again over the Thames, the fog returns, rolling through the old streets like memory itself. The light from the lamps shimmers on the water, soft and uncertain. If one listens closely, beneath the distant rumble of carriages and the whisper of the wind, one might still hear them, the faint laughter of Sparrow, the cough of old Tom, the rustle of Mary's needle through cloth. Forgotten never truly leave, they linger, unseen but eternal, in the heart of London's night. The air of the Doss House was a creature of its own, thick, heavy, and strangely alive, as though the building itself were breathing through its brick lungs. You could feel it the moment you crossed the threshold, a clinging dampness that wrapped itself around your throat and settled deep in your chest. It smelled of humanity in its rawest form, sweat and soot, damp straw and sickness that seemed to rise from the very floorboards. The walls sweated too, streaked with grime and swollen from years of trapped moisture. Every inch of this place told a story of endurance and decay. The stench was so constant that the residents no longer noticed it. For those who lived here, scent had lost its meaning. They had inhaled rot and mildew for so long that their senses had dulled into a strange tolerance. Only newcomers, those desperate souls who stumbled in from the wet London streets for the first time, seemed to gag and retch. But even they, after a few nights of hunger and cold, learned not to notice. It was survival's quiet anesthetic. The air was never still. It trembled with the hum of coughing, murmurs, the scraping of boots, and the low groans of those who could not sleep. At night, when the gaslight flickered and the shadows danced upon the peeling walls, it seemed that the doss house itself was whispering, the ceilings dripped, the vermin scurried across the floorboards. And from every dark corner came the slow rasp of lungs that had forgotten how to breathe freely. Disease was a tenant here, not a visitor. Consumption, typhus, cholera. Each had its place in the hierarchy of suffering. They did not strike in sudden fits of cruelty, but rather lingered, slow and patient, feeding on the weak like parasites. The city's poor had long become laboratories of illness, their bodies repositories for every infection born from filth and neglect. The doctors who ventured into these places came armed with pity and handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, but their sympathy rarely survived the stench. London's poor laws and charity institutions could not keep pace with the tide of bodies that flowed into its doss houses. Industrial progress had filled the city's pockets but emptied its soul. The same factories that lit the empire's furnaces also spat out men and women broken by exhaustion. The doss house became their final resting ground before the grave. And yet, amid this decay, there was a strange pulse of life. Fierce, stubborn, unrelenting, the poor clung to existence like barnacles on a rotting ship. In one corner of the room, a child coughed, a sound so sharp and sudden that it seemed to cut through the night. His mother stirred beside him, wrapping a thin shawl around his shoulders. She was little more than a skeleton herself, her cheekbones sharp as blades beneath her skin. Her hands trembled as she tried to warm the boy, but the effort was hopeless. The cold came not from outside, but from within. The dampness had crept into their very bones. Across the room, two old men argued in hoarse whispers over a scrap of bread. Their words were broken by coughs, and one of them spat into the corner before continuing his tirade. His spit was streaked with blood, but he didn't notice, or didn't care. Around them, others slept in uneasy heaps, their limbs tangled, their faces gray and hollow. The air reeked of humanity crushed too close together. It was a smell that could not be described, only endured. Above, the rafters were alive with rats. They moved with the confidence of creatures who knew they were kings here. They were fat and fearless, fed on crumbs, filth, and the occasional corpse. It was said that in some doss houses the rats learned to nibble at sleepers' toes. No one screamed anymore, they simply brushed them off and turned back to restless dreams. The sickness was not only in the body but in the spirit. Poverty twisted the soul, made men suspicious and cruel, women hard and hollow. It taught them to measure kindness by survival's terms. There was no room for sentiment in the doss house. If one fell ill, another took their place on the floor by morning. If a man died, his coat was taken before the body cooled. Death was not tragic, it was practical, an opening in a crowded room, and yet every so often a moment of humanity flickered through the gloom. Someone would share a crust of bread or offer a dry spot to a stranger. These small acts, fleeting and unremarkable, were the only proof that something human still lived amid the ruin. They were the quiet rebellions of the forgotten, proof that compassion could survive even in the dirtiest corners of London. Outside, the city was no kinder. The streets around the doss houses were black rivers of mud and refuse. The gutters overflowed with waste, and the Thames itself was a slow, moving grave of all the city's sins. The smell of the river seeped into every alley, blending with the smoke from 1,000 chimneys to create the unique perfume of industrial London. The wealthy spoke of progress and prosperity, but progress had a stench, and the poor lived in it. Doctors and social reformers began to take notice. Reports were written, pamphlets printed, and commissions formed. Men with clean boots and moral outrage ventured into the slums, their notebooks trembling in their hands. They documented what they saw: children sleeping beside corpses, families sharing a single damp mattress, air so thick with disease that lamps burned dim. They wrote of the great unwashed with pity, but also with disgust. For the Victorian mind, filth was not only a physical condition, but a moral one. The poor were seen as dirty not merely in body, but in soul. And so, instead of cures, they were offered sermons. The clergy preached about temperance, about sin, about the wages of idleness. The doss house dwellers listened, nodding when required, though they knew the truth. It was not gin or laziness that brought them here, but hunger and chance. Yet even they clung to the faint promise that faith might offer something the world had denied them: dignity, perhaps, or forgiveness for being born poor. The smell of sickness carried through the streets, marking the path to every doss house. When the night air shifted, even the respectable quarters caught a whiff of it, the sour breath of the underclass. It was a reminder that no matter how high one's ceiling, the city's filth had a way of rising. Disease did not respect class. It drifted upward like smoke, finding cracks in every wall. One might have thought the authorities would intervene, but the machinery of governance turned slowly, greased by indifference. The Metropolitan Board of Works debated, delayed, and deflected responsibility. Sanitation reforms were proposed, resisted, and buried under the weight of bureaucracy. The landlords of the doss houses, meanwhile, continued to profit. Each bed, or rather, each space upon the floor, was rented nightly. The more bodies packed in, the greater the earnings. In some places, a penny bought a rope to lean upon, another penny a patch of straw. Privacy was an impossible luxury. In this world, sickness was not just a condition, it was currency. A coughing man could be pitied for a day, ignored the next, and replaced by mourning. The strong survived, not by virtue, but by chance. The weak became ghosts long before their hearts stopped beating. The doss house was a liminal space, a waiting room between poverty and the grave. Yet for those who lived there, it was also home. The paradox of survival was cruelly simple. To endure filth was to live. To escape it was to die in the streets. Every morning, when the gaslights dimmed and daylight crept through the soot-blackened windows, the room stirred to life. The residents rose slowly, stretching limbs stiff from cold and cramp. The floor was wet with spilled water, vomit, and God knew what else. The keeper barked at them to move along, and one by one they shuffled out into the gray London dawn. The smell of smoke and sewage followed them like a second skin. The city swallowed them whole, its invisible army of forgotten souls, trudging toward another day of nothing. Behind them, the doss house returned to silence. The keeper moved through the room with a pail and rag, splashing disinfectant that only sharpened the stink. He muttered as he worked, counting the coins collected overnight. The sound of his boots sloshing through filth was the rhythm of his trade. For every body that left, another would come by dusk. The sickness never rested. It only changed faces. The rats came out again, bold and unhurried. They were the true inheritors of the doss house, the only creatures to thrive in its rot. They gnawed at scraps and gnawed at memory, their tiny feet pattering like morbid applause. The building itself seemed to exhale, a long, weary sigh that carried the scent of centuries of suffering. The sickness had become part of the architecture, woven into the very mortar of the wall. No amount of limewash or prayer could cleanse it. It lived in the damp timbers, in the straw, in the lungs of every man and woman who passed through. It was London itself, condensed into one suffocating room. By afternoon, the room would fill again. The poor drifted back like tides, drawn by exhaustion and the faint promise of shelter. They came from every corner of the city, dockworkers with splintered hands, seamstresses with sunken eyes, hawkers whose voices had long since cracked from shouting in the cold. Each carried their day upon them, the grime of the streets, the soot of the factories, the scent of stale gin and cheap bread. To an outsider, They were indistinguishable, a gray mass of fatigue, but to one who lived among them, each face bore its own history of suffering. Some had once been respectable. You could see it in their posture, their choice of words, the way they hesitated before entering. A dismissed clerk who had lost his position to illness, a widow who could no longer pay her rent, a veteran whose pension barely kept him alive. Each was a story in decay. The city swallowed them without ceremony, stripping them of pride and name until they were simply lodgers. The Das Haus did not ask questions, and they did not offer answers. Survival required silence. The smell inside deepened with the heat of bodies. A thick vapor rose from the floorboards, an invisible fog of human waste and damp straw. The gaslight burned dimly through it, turning every face a sickly shade of yellow. The keeper moved through the room with the authority of one accustomed to misery. He shouted for quiet, though no one had spoken. His boots made soft sounds in the filth, and his lantern's glow revealed more than he perhaps wished to see: lice crawling upon collars, sores crusted over with dirt, and the hollow eyes of hunger that followed him as he passed. The sickness had many names, but none so common as the cough. It began as a tickle in the throat, then deepened into a rattle that shook the ribs. At first, the sufferers hid it, fearful of being turned away. But soon it became impossible to conceal. Night after night, the Das Haus echoed with the sound, a chorus of hollow, rhythmic hacking that mingled with the squeak of rats and the creak of the building's bones. In the dark, you could tell who would not last the week by the depth of their cough. Sometimes the coughing stopped, then the silence spoke louder than any sound. A body would be still for too long, and by morning, the keeper would drag it away beneath a sheet. The others hardly looked up. Death was no stranger here. It came like a tax collector, punctual and inevitable. The bodies were taken to paupers' graves, buried without name or prayer, a trench shared by dozens of others. No one visited, no one remembered. The sickness devoured the living and forgot the dead. In the narrow streets outside, the stench was magnified. The sewers overflowed, and the Thames, sluggish and dark, carried the waste of millions. On humid days, the river's breath rolled through the city like a curse. People stuffed rags into their windows, doused them with vinegar, and prayed the wind would change. The great stink, as the newspapers called it, had become more than a nuisance. It was an omen. Doctors warned that miasmas, the invisible vapors of decay, carried death upon them. They were not entirely wrong, though they knew nothing of the true carriers that crept unseen beneath their feet. Inside the Das Haus, miasma was not a theory. It was life itself. Every breath was shared, recycled through lungs weakened by hunger and gin. The walls sweated contagion. A single sick man could fell a dozen others without ever knowing it. The smell of sickness was oddly metallic, sweet and foul at once. It clung to clothing, to hair, to memory. Even when one stepped outside, the ghost of it followed, a reminder that there was no escape from poverty's perfume. There were moments when the city seemed to turn its eyes toward these forgotten corners. Reformers wrote of the abyss. Journalists ventured in with notebooks trembling. Sketch artists captured the faces of the damned. Their reports shocked polite society for a week or two, until another scandal, another spectacle, drew their gaze away. London's appetite for horror was matched only by its indifference. The poor became curiosities, specimens to be studied, pitied, and forgotten. The sickness was simply part of the city's machinery, as necessary to its rhythm as the chimneys and the fog. The doctors came sometimes, young men with starched collars and the idealism of fresh education. They brought tinctures, tonics, and pamphlets about hygiene. They preached about fresh air and cleanliness, as though such luxuries could be conjured from nothing. The Das Haus dwellers listened, polite but unmoved. What use was advice about washing when water itself was scarce, when soap was a week's wages, when to open a window meant to invite in the bitter cold? The doctors left shaking their heads, muttering about ignorance, never understanding that knowledge could not clean what poverty had already stained. Among the women, sickness took on a different cruelty. Many were mothers, and their children bore the marks of the same decay. Infants were born with the rattle already in their chests, their tiny bodies struggling against the same invisible weight. The mothers coughed and prayed, pressing their babies close, as though warmth alone could ward off death. But warmth was rare, and mercy rarer still. The graveyards filled with nameless children, their graves marked only by the memory of those who had the strength to remember. At times, the sickness seemed to mock them. Those who drank to numb their hunger often lived longer than those who stayed sober, though they died madder. Gin was both poison and salvation, a cheap escape from the stink, a brief forgetfulness in a world where the senses were one's greatest enemy. The reformers condemned it as the devil's drink, but the Das House called it medicine. A few swallows could bring warmth to frozen limbs and courage to face another night. It dulled the pain of coughing, quieted the despair of hunger. In a place where doctors and priests had failed, gin became the only priest that listened. The air of London in the 19th century was thick not only with smoke, but with a kind of moral sickness as well. The city's wealthiest men built monuments to their progress, while stepping carefully around the corpses of the poor. Parliament debated the cost of drainage systems, while thousands died of cholera in the East End. To the rich, disease was an inconvenience. To the poor, it was destiny. The sickness was not only in their lungs, it was in the very structure of society, a contagion of indifference spreading from the drawing rooms to the gutters. At dusk, the Das House came alive again. The coughing began its nightly chorus, mingled with snores, muttered prayers, and the faint sound of weeping. The air grew heavy as bodies pressed closer together, seeking warmth. In the flicker of the gaslight, faces blurred into one another, a living mural of suffering. Somewhere in the dark, a child cried out, then fell silent. The silence lasted longer than it should have. The mother's sobs were quiet, resigned. No one moved to comfort her. They had all heard it before. The keeper, pacing near the door, paused only to light his pipe. He had long ceased to notice the smell. To him, it was the scent of business, as ordinary as the smell of coal to a miner or salt to a sailor. He took a long drag and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling through the haze. It mingled with the miasma, a fragile imitation of peace. By morning, the sickness would claim another. The cart would come, as it always did, and the body would be taken away. The others would watch in silence, their faces unreadable. Then they would return to their work, their begging, their wandering through the grey labyrinth of London. Life went on, indifferent to its own misery. There was, however, a kind of strange dignity in endurance. To live another day in such conditions required more courage than the city's finest officers could imagine. The poor were soldiers in an unending war against the elements, against hunger, against death itself. They had no medals, no honor, no remembrance, but they had persistence, a stubborn defiance that refused to die even as their bodies wasted away. It was not hope that kept them alive, but something quieter, deeper, the refusal to surrender. As the century turned and the great reforms began to stir, change came slowly to the Das houses. Sanitation improved, inspectors came with clipboards and authority, and the most notorious lodging rooms were closed. But the sickness did not vanish. It simply moved elsewhere, into newer buildings with cleaner walls, but the same old despair. Poverty had changed its face, not its nature. The poor still coughed, still starved, still dreamed of a warmth they could never afford. And so the memory of those stinking dens lingered in the fabric of London itself. The city grew outward, built railways and monuments, theaters, and parks. But beneath it all, the ghosts of the doss houses remained. Their breath mingled with the fog that rolled in from the river. Their whispers echoed in the cracks of brick and stone. The sickness had shaped them, and in turn, they had shaped the city. For every grand avenue, there had once been an alley where the forgotten had lain, breathing the same fetid air and praying for dawn. Even now, if one walks through the older quarters of London on a damp winter night, there are moments when the past seems to rise from the pavement. The smell of wet soot, the sound of distant coughing carried by the wind, these are echoes of that other London, the one that lived and died in darkness. The city remembers, even if its people do not. The sickness and the stench are long gone, but their shadow endures, clinging to the edges of history like the smell of smoke that never quite fades. The watchers came in silence at first, moving like uncertain ghosts through the alleys of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. They were men and women of the middle and upper classes, wrapped in woolen coats and armed with notebooks, lanterns, and a peculiar mixture of curiosity and horror. They came to see what the newspapers called the abyss, the underworld of London, where filth, poverty, and moral decay were said to dwell in dreadful intimacy. To them, the doss houses were not merely shelters. They were laboratories of human misery, living museums of degradation that demanded to be studied, reformed, and, above all, pitied. They entered these places cautiously, some covering their noses with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume or vinegar. Smell met them first, a choking, oily stench that turned even the most determined reformer pale. Then came the heat, the suffocating closeness of air, recycled through 100 diseased lungs. Beneath it all was the unmistakable hum of life, coughing, muttering, the scrape of boots on filth, the faint rattle of tin cups. For the watchers, these were the sounds of revelation, a symphony of suffering that confirmed every suspicion about the moral state of the poor. Many of the early visitors were clergymen, moved by Christian zeal and an almost apocalyptic sense of duty. They saw themselves as shepherds among lost sheep, determined to bring light into the dens of darkness. Some came to preach, some to distribute tracts, others to count the bodies and record the statistics of despair. They spoke of salvation and cleanliness as though the two were twins. Yet for all their good intentions, they often mistook poverty for sin and filth for vice. Their words echoed in the fetid air, grand sermons addressed to hollow eyes and empty stomachs. Still, among these watchers were a few who saw more clearly. They looked beyond the dirt and disease, past the drink and despair, and perceived the system that had built these dens brick by brick. They saw how factories paid starvation wages, how landlords profited from overcrowding, how the city's wealth was piled high upon the backs of those who lived and died unseen. To these rare reformers, the stench of the doss house was not merely physical. It was the moral odor of a society that had learned to live comfortably beside rot. One such watcher, a young journalist from the Pall Mall Gazette, entered a doss house on Flower and Dean Street one bitter winter night. He wrote later that it was like descending into the underworld. The air, he said, was thick enough to cut with a knife, the floor sticky beneath his boots. Around him lay men and women too weary even to look up. He described the faces as pale ghosts lit by the trembling flame of a single candle, and he left the place sickened but changed. His words would ignite a public outcry that echoed through Parliament, drawing attention to conditions long ignored. But outrage, like smoke, disperses quickly in London's wind. The reformers who followed came armed not with pity alone, but with plans. They brought diagrams, architectural proposals, and sanitary theories. They spoke of ventilation, drainage, and cubic feet per lodger. They wanted to replace the rotting dens with model lodging houses, clean, orderly establishments where the poor could sleep without disease or temptation. Philanthropic societies were founded, meetings held, and donations collected. For a time, it seemed the watchers might truly become healers, yet the poor were not always eager to be reformed. The new model houses demanded regularity and rules: no drinking, no loitering, no children after hours. They were bright and clean, but also sterile and suspicious. The old doss houses, for all their filth, offered something the reformers could not understand: freedom. In the dark, no one asked questions. No one pried into your past or judged your sins. To many, that freedom was worth more than a clean bed. So while the reformers built, the old lodging houses still filled each night, their doors closing upon another generation of the forgotten. Among the most tireless watchers were the women reformers, the lady visitors, as they were called. They came armed with notebooks, moral conviction, and parasols held like swords. Some were moved by genuine compassion, others by the thrill of confronting the forbidden. To step into a doss house was, for a lady of standing, to descend into an alien world. They described it in their diaries as a journey into the city's soul, a place where humanity was stripped bare. They left behind them pamphlets, soup, and sermons, often unaware that what the poor needed most was neither religion nor pity, but justice. Still, their work was not without effect. The sight of women of wealth standing amid the filth of the East End stirred the conscience of the nation. The newspapers printed their testimonies in lurid detail: infants born upon cold floors, women giving birth in corners while rats watched, men dying upright against the walls. The readers were horrified and entertained. London's appetite for moral spectacle was endless. Even outrage became a kind of theater, performed nightly in parlors far removed from the smell of the slums. As the century advanced, reform gained momentum. Men like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew began to map poverty with scientific precision, turning the misery of the poor into data. They walked the streets, cataloging faces, trades, wages, and vices. Booth's maps, shaded in ominous colors from crimson to black, revealed the geography of despair that underlay the glittering metropolis. The doss houses were the darkest stains upon that map, the final destination of lives reduced to nothing. To see them rendered in ink was to realize that poverty was not a fringe condition. It was the foundation upon which the entire city stood. With every report, the watchers peeled back another layer of illusion. They showed that the slums were not accidents, but inevitabilities. They existed because they were profitable. Each bed in a doss house represented income for a landlord. Each family crammed into a single room meant rent multiplied. Reformers could preach morality all they wished, but as long as misery paid dividends, the system endured. The watchers might illuminate the darkness, but the light they carried revealed not only the suffering of the poor, it exposed the greed of the rich. Still, the doss houses changed, if only in appearance. By the 1880s, the worst of them were condemned or bought out by reform societies. Some were replaced with hostels run by the Salvation Army or charitable trusts. These new shelters offered cleaner air, stricter rules, and the illusion of salvation. The reformers called them gateways to redemption. The lodgers called them prisons without walls. Yet, to many, they were the only choice between sleeping under a roof or under the stars. The watchers did not all agree on the cure. Some believed in moral reform, temperance, thrift, hard work. Others saw the root in economics, low wages, unemployment, the collapse of rural life that drove thousands to the city. Still others, particularly among the radicals, called for revolution. They saw the doss house not as a symptom, but as proof that the entire structure of society was diseased. You cannot clean the cesspool without rebuilding the city, one socialist pamphlet declared. But such words found few sympathetic ears in Parliament. There was something hauntingly ironic about the reformers themselves. Many of them, for all their compassion, were as dependent on poverty as the landlords they condemned. Their causes, their societies, their speeches, all derived meaning from the existence of suffering. Without the poor, their virtue would have no mirror, and so, even as they labored to heal, they too became part of the spectacle, a moral theater in which pity and power danced an endless waltz. In the midst of all this, the Das Haus residents remained what they had always been, survivors. They watched the reformers come and go, listened to their promises, and continued to live as best they could. To them, reform was a word that belonged to the newspapers, not to their lives. What they wanted was not salvation, but rest, a dry floor, a bit of bread, a few hours without pain. The watchers might write reports, the philanthropists might build new walls, but the poor still carried the sickness and the stench within them, as in septum.